Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session, Using Logic Models to Think Through Local Growth Policies. This is a short 45-minute long session to help busy policymakers think through local growth interventions. I'm Megan Streb, Deputy Director of Outreach at the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. We help to make local growth policy more cost-effective through better use of evidence and evaluation. Now, today's session is going to focus on how to use logic models as a framework for thinking about interventions, being realistic about outcomes and ensuring that you're selecting the right interventions. Now, after the presentation, we're going to move on to a Q&A, so please submit your questions throughout. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our Deputy Director of Evidence, Victoria Sutherland.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone. Bear with me for 2 seconds just while I get the PowerPoint up. Okay, Megan, could you just give me a signal that everyone can see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. So today's session is about using logic models. And in particular, what I really want to think about is how do we make sure that our local growth policies are as effective and as impactful as possible. So I guess the sensible place to start is to have a little kind of talk through what a logic model or a theory of change is, and then we can begin to look at some of the ways in which you can use that to think about effectiveness and impact. I'll most probably use logic model and theory of change interchangeably as I'm talking today. They are slightly different. I think the easiest way to think about it is the theory of change sets out how your intervention is going to deliver the change that you are trying to achieve. And a logic model is really just a way of kind of graphically demonstrating that theory of change. So the thing that I think is so useful about a theory of change or a logic model is that it forces you to think about your policy or your program or your project systematically. So we would always argue that when you're doing your theory of change or your logic model, you should start in the top left-hand corner. So you'll see that there's 2 boxes there. One is around need and one is around policy context. So the need is, what's the problem that you are trying to solve within your local economy? So depending on what your particular area's economics look like, and also I suspect a little bit depending on what your role is, maybe that's about transport connectivity. Maybe it's about a low business startup rate. Maybe it's about low productivity, but even if it's about low productivity, is it about a lack of kind of tangible and intangible capital? So, machinery, software, research and development, design, branding that your companies have at their disposal. Is it a lack of skills? The needs can be very, very diverse. I think one of the real challenges that people often face when they're putting together a logic model is a temptation to kind of throw everything in the kitchen sink into that need box. So lots of places will have, for example, high unemployment, or at least relatively high unemployment, low business birth rates, low levels of innovation, perhaps a raft of kind of other challenges, but you're rarely going to have an intervention that is able to address all of those things. Addressing one of those things is quite challenging. And therefore, I would always argue that your kind of need should focus on something that is relatively narrow. If you make it too big, or too complex with too many different things in it, it's very, very difficult to have a program that is effective. I should also say here, I'm saying need. It could well be an opportunity. Not everything in local economic growth is, kind of trying to address issues that are negative. Sometimes there are opportunities that we might be able to take advantage of. The other blue box in that top left-hand corner is around the policy context. So all of us know that regardless of what challenges our area is facing, we're only able to act when there are strategies, plans, funds, commitment by our senior leaders, both officials and politicians around the issue that we're trying to tackle. So we think it's a kind of good practice to also kind of set out, what is that policy context that's going to enable you to do something to address the need. Perhaps slightly counterintuitively, we then wouldn't jump to thinking about, okay, well, how much money is available, what are we going to do, etc. We would argue that what you should do next with your theory of change is to kind of jump to the end. What is the change that we're trying to deliver? And by thinking about that allows us to kind of set out the objectives and outcomes and the impacts that we are trying to achieve. And only then would we go back and think about the inputs, the activities, and the outputs. I think one of the bits that people often really struggle with this is kind of what the difference between an output and an outcome is. The way we think about it is that outputs are the things that the policy is trying to deliver, but the outcomes and the impacts are the changes that you're trying to get to. So I'm about to show an example in a minute, but a kind of very simple one is if you had training for the unemployed, often them getting the qualification would be the output, but actually we don't really care about the qualifications. What we care about is that unemployed person getting into work. So the getting into and sustaining work is the outcome, whereas the output is, they've completed the course, they've gained the qualification, they've completed a period of work experience, etc. Okay. So I'm going to use one example throughout today's session, and I've picked, just because it's a relatively simple thing and because it kind of builds on something I was doing a couple of weeks ago, so it was kind of very front of mind, I've put together a little program here which is around export support. So what we've got here is we've got, our need is, so we all know that tradable businesses are important to our local economies, okay, or at least I hope we all know that. Tradable economies are businesses that sell their goods or services outside of the local market. And they're important for a range of different reasons, but one of the reasons is that they tend to be higher productivity businesses, higher value added businesses. So they're bringing more into the local economy. So what we've got here is we've got an area where the issue is they've got lots of businesses that are selling to other parts of the UK, but actually very few of those businesses are then going on to export internationally. So the thinking is, like, we've got tradable businesses, they're high productivity, but actually they haven't grown to the size that they could have because they haven't explored these other markets. And we've got a policy context here where, local growth plans prioritising employment and productivity and calls out the importance of tradable businesses to achieving this. So, perhaps also there's some funds attached to that around, high growth businesses, etc. So that's our need and context here. And that leads us to setting an objective to increase the number of businesses that are exporting internationally. And then to achieve outcomes around a number of businesses that have started to export, and also that turnover has increased in those businesses. So there's a couple of things to note here. Number one, this is a very, very simple objective. It could have been much more complex. So we could have made it much more explicit that it was about increasing the number of businesses exporting in order to deliver productivity improvements or increased employment. But I've stuck with kind of the simpler version of it here. And that's really just so that there's a really strong focus on that goal of increasing exporting. Because I find that the broader your objectives are, the more scope there is for kind of people beginning to interpret it as being about different things. On the outcomes, I mean, I think the one about, businesses having started to export within 12 months, the thing that I think is useful to kind of note there is I've kind of said 12 months, that, we don't expect businesses to go through the programme and automatically start exporting. This is something that will take time to get in place, for them to secure contracts or deals that lead it. So there's that aspect. I've put the one in turnover in because what's not really explicit in the objectives or in the having started to export outcome is that you could have a scenario where a business begins to export, let's say to France or to Sweden, but they end up selling less to the other bits of the UK. And in that case, what you've got is you've got a kind of form of displacement, or perhaps another way to think about it is, there's no additionality. So you're not actually getting anything extra. So that's not because we care about turnover so much as it's a way of kind of ensuring that what's happening is additional. Something else to kind of note here is that I've gone for a number of businesses exporting. You could have framed this in a number of different ways. So you could have done it about the value of the exports, or you could have done it, around the number of markets that were being exported to. Perhaps if they were businesses that were already exporting to a couple of markets and you were looking for them to expand it. Again, we could have done it about turnover or sales. We could have done it about employment. But I kind of feel that in terms of your outcomes, you're best having something that you're likely to see within the medium term. Even if you can get businesses beginning to export, something like employment or productivity is going to take a much longer time to come through. So I think it's always worth thinking a little bit about your timescales as well. And then you'll see in our inputs, activities and outputs, I haven't kind of set out a budget or the amount of staff time, but that's the kind of stuff you'd be looking for there. I've suggested there's going to be, a marketing campaign to kind of increase awareness and interest and engagement in the idea of exporting, some one-to-one advice, and kind of 3 trade missions to kind of 3 key markets. And then on the outputs, we've kind of added some numbers. So, 200 businesses at events, 60 businesses getting one-to-one advice, and 30 businesses participating in trade visits. So this is really our kind of example. So in terms of thinking about how you can use the logic model to think about impact and effectiveness, we think there's kind of 3 stages at which you can do this. So the first one, and probably the most important one, is to think about it during project development. So our argument would be that if you use a logic model or a theory of change to think systematically about the nature of your problem, what you're trying to achieve, and the best way to achieve it during project development, you're likely to end up with a better policy, a better designed policy, and a greater clarity about what you're trying to achieve, and a better chance that you're actually going to achieve that. So there's a couple of elements to how the logic model can help. So we think it can act as a prompt for evidence. It can act as a way of sense checking what you're doing, why you're doing it, what your chances of success are. And we also think it can be really useful in helping you develop a common understanding of what you're trying to achieve across your different stakeholders. So to think about the first of them as a prompt of evidence, there's different kinds of evidence that you might want to look at when you're developing your logic model. So if we start with the top left-hand corner and the need and context, I would like to hope that all local economic growth policies start from a point of looking at kind of economic performance at the local level, what's working well, what's not working so well, and then digging into the bits that aren't working so well to try and understand the nature of those problems. If you did that, That should be the thing that identifies that exporting is an issue in your area. But then you would be wanting to dig into the data on exporting in more detail. So which businesses are exporting and who isn't? How does that vary across sectors, across different sizes of businesses? You know, are there common characteristics amongst the ones that aren't exporting? You know, because all of this is going to help inform your policy design. And yes, data is important, but for something like this, you know, there's going to be local business surveys that will tell you things about why, you know, what businesses are doing, why they're doing it, why they're not doing it. But there's also going to be local intelligence, you know, your chamber, you know, your other, perhaps you've got sectoral bodies, you know, all of them will know about what's happening, and, or at least a bit of the jigsaw of what's happening and why it's happening, that can help inform your policy design. In terms of your inputs, your activities, and your outputs, I would argue we maybe think about them less often in terms of evidence, but I would argue if you've run a programme like this before or something similar, or perhaps you haven't, but other local authorities or combined authorities have, I think getting the programme data, the monitoring data from previous approaches can be really useful in terms of understanding, like, how much of a budget do we need? You know, how many businesses are going to be in scope? You know, what proportion of businesses do we get engaging in different kinds of programs? You know, there'll be lots of really useful stuff in terms of kind of scale and kind of take up and completion rates that you should be able to get from your monitoring and programme data. And then the final one, and the one that you'll not be surprised to hear us promote, because this is the thing that what work centres do, is around the evaluation evidence. So the evaluation evidence really comes into play in terms of thinking about the outcomes and the impacts. And in particular, what good quality counterfactual impact evaluation evidence does is it tells you whether a set of activities leads to a set of outcomes. So as an example, I have pulled up the evidence that we've got on export promotion agencies. We've actually also got some evidence on export credit agencies. So they are kind of, export credit agencies are the ones that offer kind of loan guarantees for businesses around kind of export activities. Export promotion activities is, you know, kind of information to help businesses export, advice, guidance, everything through, you know, from very light touch stuff through to very intensive support, you know, so sometimes you'll have support in country that will help make introductions, you know, kind of broker agreements, etc. So we've got some evidence on this. One level, it's kind of very positive. So we've got 11 studies and 5 of them find that it leads to businesses increasing exports. And then the other 4 are mixed. So what we mean is it's in a mixed study, it's positive for some sectors, but not others, or positive for some kinds of support, but not others, or some types of firms, so perhaps big ones, you know, small ones, but not big ones, etc. So that should give us confidence in the logic model that we saw in the previous slide, because what we're saying is we're going to do some export promotion activities and we're expecting it to lead to an increase in the number of firms exporting. The evidence review definitely suggests that this kind of activity can lead to that kind of outcome. The evidence also gives us some kind of insights that might encourage us to go back to that logic model and change some things. So, for example, it finds that generally lighter touch market information tends to be more effective than intensive market service provision. What I would say is on the previous slide is much more towards that lighter touch than the more intensive stuff. So maybe that gives us some confidence again that this is likely to be effective. What's interesting though is there isn't much evidence on what kinds of businesses benefit. So maybe that's a frame that we should be thinking about our logic model around. So, we've just said businesses at the moment, but should we be targeting this program at particular kind of businesses? And that could be very specific, so businesses within specific sectors, or it could just be something quite broad, like, are we only going to target businesses that currently have fewer than 50 employees? If you're bigger than that, we think you can most probably type on your own. So there's questions around that. I think the one that's most probably most interesting on this is that actually there's very little evidence that export promotion can lead on to higher employment, higher productivity, higher levels of investment, etc. So if we just go back to the logic model for a minute, that's all this stuff that mainly is in our impacts box, our kind of longer term, higher level changes that we're expecting to see. At the moment, I've not attached any numbers to that, but given that we know there isn't much evaluation evidence on that, I would be really cautious about putting anything other than quite a small change in that box, because we just don't know. We know that the link between the activities and the outcomes is pretty well established, but there is much less evidence of the link between the outcomes and the impacts. So the evidence tells me that I should be cautious here. Okay, something else that I just wanted to flag is when you're looking at the evidence, it's really important to focus on the evidence that links to the outcomes that you are trying to achieve. Okay, so for example, if you are trying to achieve an improvement in employment, but the evidence is all about improvements in productivity, you wouldn't want to be looking at that evidence. You want to tie it up. Sometimes you have a kind of the activity, so your program design is going to be really closely connected to your outcome. So for example, we only tend to do trade missions in order to increase exports. Okay, we don't do trade missions, to improve innovation or to increase startups. Whereas in contrast, if you were trying to increase startups, you might have an incubator as an intervention, but you wouldn't ever do an incubator to increase exports, because that's not, they don't align up. The place where you need to be a bit careful about this is when you've got an intervention that could be used across different kinds of outcomes. So one-to-one business advice is used quite broadly. Okay, we use it for all sorts of different things. We use it for, improving management and leadership, for improving energy efficiency, for encouraging innovation, for startups, for increasing exports. So just be careful where you've got something that's a kind of broad category, that you are making sure that both the kind of intervention and the outcomes are allied with what you're looking at. Because if it's not allied, it's less kind of transferable over to your experience. Okay, so the second thing that was on my list was around sense checking. So sense checking is just really thinking about the hows and the whys, okay? So for example, on our inputs, I would always be asking, is the budget sufficient? If we're saying it's staff time, do we have the skills and the expertise to deliver this in-house? If not, does that mean that we're going to have to contract it out? And if we're contracting out, it's probably going to cost more. So what does that mean in relation to our budget? Does it have to go out, or does it have to go up, or do we have to cut the amount that we're delivering, etc.? A really, really important stage to check is between your activities and your outputs and your outputs and your outcomes. Okay, so something to always ask yourself is, how realistic are these? Okay, so if we're going to give one-to-one advice to 60 businesses, okay, if there are 300 or 3,000 businesses in our local economy that meet our criteria and could, fall into the catchment, 60 is fine, because you're definitely going to get 60, if you've got 5 times or 50 times that number in the market. But if there are only 80 businesses that actually meet your criteria, the chances of getting 60 of them onto your program are quite slim. Okay. Similarly, you might want to think about the numbers that you're seeing in here. So what we've got is 200 that are coming to the very light touch, events, little bit of information, 60 that are getting, the more intensive one-to-one advice, perhaps an action plan, and 30 that are coming on trade visits. How realistic is it that of that, kind of more intensive 60, 2/3 of them, so 40, are going to start to export in the next 12 months? So again, that's the kind of thing where you would want to be going back to your evidence and understand how realistic that seems. The final one, just on project development, is around developing a common understanding. So our argument would always be that if you do this collaboratively, so if you've got a range of different organisations involved, you've got perhaps stakeholders who are going to refer in, you've perhaps got contractors who are going to deliver. Doing this together makes it more likely that you are all on the same page. Okay. I think the other thing about that is that can be quite helpful in terms of making sure that you've kind of got a narrative about how you're going to talk about the project with others. And also it can kind of act as kind of a confidence boosting thing for your funders, that you actually do genuinely understand kind of what you're going to deliver and how you're going to deliver it. So the two other ways in which I think logic models can really help are in project implementation. So I think if you've developed a really good logic model, and I appreciate that the one we've got here is very kind of high level because I need to get it on a slide, and if it's too detailed, then it would take me too long to talk about it today. But if you've got a good quality theory of change and logic model where you've clearly articulated your inputs, your activities, and your outputs, then that should act as the beginnings of your monitoring framework. So we know that in this, that we're saying we're trying to reach 200 businesses through events, that there'll be 60 that are getting one-to-one advice, that there's 30 that are going to be on trade visits. But we'll also have set out a budget and staff time and activities. So they can very much be the framework for what you're monitoring, okay? The thing I would really argue about that, though, is you then have to use that monitoring data. There's no point in just collecting it. If you've specified your program well, and you're confident that you can achieve your outcomes, you need to be delivering the activities as planned, delivering the outputs as planned in order to achieve those outcomes. If you end up off track, it's much more difficult to achieve your outcomes. And therefore, monitoring can allow you to kind of adjust as you go. So very much it helps frame your monitoring, but you need to use that monitoring data to get your full benefit from it. And then the final thing that I think you can use it for is after project implementation, it can help you understand what to value. So in particular, impact evaluation is asking the question, did these activities lead to the outcomes that we were intending? So in this case, it would be, does this mix of marketing campaign, one-to-one advice, and trade mission, did that lead to an increase in businesses exporting and an increase in turnover? Now, this programme isn't big enough to do a counterfactual impact evaluation, but actually you'd still want to be looking at that question as a kind of programme manager. And if it was much bigger, you would be able to do a good quality impact evaluation. The one other option here is if you've got some discretion, you might be able to answer a slightly more nuanced question, which is, if the one-to-one advice could have two different models, one where it was maybe 12 hours, quite light touch, and another one where it was maybe 60 hours and much more intensive, you could then compare the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of those two different options. Or perhaps an option where you had advice and a trade mission versus one where there was just advice. And that would help you learn more for future policies. And that, I think, is is something that I think's really important for us all to grasp. And we actually had a blog published last week on this called Evaluation for the Common Good, which is the better we can all get at doing our theories of change and our logic models, and then gathering the monitoring and evaluation and making sure that we're feeding it back in to future objective setting, appraisals, etc., we'll get to better policies over the long term, so more effective, more impactful. The very final thing I want to say is I've set out kind of 3 ways in which it can feed in to helping us think about impact of effectiveness, but this stuff isn't just going to happen. It's much more likely to happen if you actually have some processes in place, you know, to ensure that the logic model happens at the project development stage, you know, to make sure that it's not just a box filling, but actually an exercise of using evidence, you know, working collaboratively, etc. And then again, processes to make sure that monitoring and evaluation happen. Okay, that's me. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, so we've had a couple questions that have come in. So so the first one was about when you're designing the program, what do you do when the evaluation evidence around effectiveness is really mixed? So how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, so I mean, the evidence is often mixed on evaluation. And I suppose I should say the evidence is actually often mixed on other elements too, you know, so in terms of understanding the need or the nature of the problem, you know, or, you know, perhaps kind of like what take-up rates have been across different programs. That can also be quite mixed. So the evaluation evidence tends to be, so there's 2 different ways of thinking about kind of mixed. There can be stuff where, you know, let's say we're looking at an outcome. So let's just say employment, because it's the easiest one to think out. It might be that you've got some studies that have found a positive impact on employment, some that have found no effect, and you might occasionally will find some where there's been a negative effect. Okay, so you can have mixed in that sense. Okay, but what you can also have is you can have studies where the findings are mixed. Okay, so that's a study where, you know, a program that worked with, that worked with businesses in different sectors found it worked for manufacturing businesses, but it didn't work for service businesses, or vice versa. Or you've got an element where there were 2 different elements of the program, and one element did work and one element didn't work. Okay, so there's different different kinds of mix, I guess, is what I'm saying. If it's one of those ones where it worked for some sectors and not other sectors, that's actually great, because that allows you to have a little bit more understanding, you know, because is your thing going to work with one of those sectors or not? If it's generic, it tells you that maybe you need to be a little bit more cautious about the outcomes for the group where the previous evaluation showed it didn't work or it wasn't as effective. Okay, the bit where you've got kind of like studies that found a positive effect and then others that found no effect is slightly different, because what we never really know, or at least we would know if we had millions of evaluations, but we don't have millions of evaluations. What we don't ever really know is, in the cases where it didn't work, is it that that program doesn't work? Or is it that that program didn't work in that context? Okay. Or is it that that program does work, but actually they did a bad job of delivering that program? So the thing I would say is, like, take heart from the studies that found a positive impact, but where there are kind of no effects, like, use that as a mechanism to kind of not overpromise for what you're going to deliver. Okay, because it might well be that, you know, if was one of the programs that was a new evaluation, maybe that would, but very much think about context and think about delivery. I should say it's very, very rare that we find programs that have a negative impact on the outcome that they're trying to achieve. So, and this is the thing, it's not like if you've got a good case for something and there's some evidence, then actually if you design it in a good way, you're adding to our evidence base about what works or what doesn't work. So I would just say use it as a way to be cautious rather than a way of stopping you from doing stuff.
I think also that it's useful, the point that you made looking at the logic models, like on business advice, and you said that actually business advice, depending on what advice you're offering, who your advice you're offering it to, you're going to go for different outcomes. And there's going to be probably quite a few studies, not necessarily where we find mixed effects, but where we find no effect. And that might be because actually that particular activity isn't a good fit for that kind of outcome, yes. Right? And so I think also as you're designing things, kind of as you're looking at the evaluation evidence, using that logic model to really think through, okay, what do we think there's likely to be an outcome on wages or on levels of innovation, and really use that to kind of test some of those assumptions as you're also looking at evidence of from elsewhere. We also have a question. Someone's developing a skills strategy to address local skills shortages. The area has a lot of innovative businesses. The consultant they're working with wants to take on a community wealth building approach, which emphasizes the importance of population serving industries. So how do you deal with can a logic model help you think through some of the tensions, presumably between which industries are going to take some of the focus for this skills strategy?
Yeah, I mean, so I think a logic model is a good tool for figuring out what you're trying, like whether the thing that you're proposing is going to deliver the change that you want to deliver or not. So what I'm not quite sure about this question is obviously I'd used export promotion. So I was talking about tradable businesses because that's very much kind of the sphere. I'm not sure whether the tension that the question's about addressing is between whether you should be addressing kind of the problem of tradables versus non-tradables, because I think that's what you mean by the population serving industries. If it is, I would argue that that's probably a tension, that's a question, are we focusing on our tradables or are we focusing on our non-tradables? That's probably a question that you need to have resolved before you get to the kind of project design phase. But if you've got beyond that and you've ended up with a logic model where those two things are kind of both in the mix, and that's the thing that's making the program a bit kind of jangly and why it's not quite stacking up, I think you can definitely do the, starting with our need. Okay, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve? So the objectives and the outcomes, and then what are we going to do as a way of beginning to disentangle that if you're at the stage where it's already kind of in design or perhaps even in implementation, but that tension's the thing that's kind of causing it to be less effective. I'm hoping that answers the question.
If it doesn't, feel free to email us.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you're on K-Hub, post it to K-Hub. We're always happy to follow up and stuff.
And I think using logic models to think through those tensions is really useful, because logic models are super flexible, right? You can use it in a way that works for you. They don't have to be shared. You can use it just to help structure your thinking, make a bazillion changes to it. And so actually the final version of your skills strategy might be completely different. But I think that it helps you think through that logic between, well, are we hoping through our skills strategy to support the local, a local aging population by making sure that we have enough people in health and care work, right? And that's a very different outcome to, we want our residents to have more productive, higher paid jobs, which is going to kind of secure better wages, right? Both are super important for your local residents, but they're going to mean really different sets of activities, right? So I think a logic model absolutely can kind of help you think through. What I would say is that you'd want to go through outcome by outcome to kind of track them back, rather than probably thinking about it as one logic model that's going to encompass everything, at least in that early stages, right? Okay, we are almost out of time. So I'm going to do some wrapping up stuff. By all means, continue asking questions on K-Hub. So that if you work in local government, khub.net is available for people in the public sector. You can ask to join our group, which is Local Economic Growth in the UK. We'll send out information afterwards, but it's all available through khub.net. I mean, also tell your colleagues if they work in planning. There's a planning advisory service K-Hub group as well. In terms of other stuff from us, we have a logic model guide, which is called Using Logic Models. So do take a look at that. We also have some upcoming events. So on Thursday, we are going to be guest presenters at an ONS local webinar series. We're going to delve into how to make the most of available ONS data on productivity and income, right? All that important evidence gathering stuff that you need right at the start of your logic models. We also have another webinar on Monday, the 23rd of February. It's only going to be 45 minutes. Perfect to, if you're working from home, you don't have a camera on, you can sit, you can listen, you can have your lunch. That one's also going to be a bit more of a deep dive on available productivity data. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, you can find that at the bottom of our website. Do join us on that. Our website is whatworksgrowth.org, where you'll get information on the logic models. It's also where we list upcoming events and training. And there's also the evidence review. So the ones that Victoria mentioned about exporting and how to improve exporting, that's all on there too. This recording is going to be on our YouTube page. So if you want to watch again, it will be available on there. We'll also include that when we send around the slides to everybody if you want to share it with colleagues. So thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you at another event soon.